After a breakup, the avoidant expects to feel relief and validation after ending a relationship, anticipating that distance will restore their sense of independence and emotional equilibrium. Instead, they experience a psychological phenomenon that contradicts everything they believe about themselves and relationships. They feel progressively worse as time passes after the breakup. This deteriorating emotional state challenges their fundamental assumptions about what makes them happy and reveals the hidden costs of their defensive strategies in ways they never anticipated. Initially, the avoidant does experience the expected relief. The pressure of managing someone else's emotions, the anxiety of potential vulnerability, the fear of losing their independence, all of these stresses disappear with the relationship's end. They feel validated in their decision, convinced that their discomfort was evidence of incompatibility rather than their own emotional limitations. This initial period reinforces their belief that relationships are burdensome obstacles to their well-being, rather than sources of genuine fulfillment. But as days turn into weeks and weeks into months, something unexpected happens. The relief doesn't deepen into lasting contentment. Instead, it gradually gives way to a creeping sense of emptiness that the avoidant struggles to understand or acknowledge. They find themselves thinking about their former partner more frequently rather than less, missing aspects of the relationship they didn't appreciate while it was happening, and feeling increasingly hollow, despite having everything they thought they wanted, the delayed recognition of loss. The avoidant's emotional processing operates on a delayed timeline that prevents them from immediately recognizing what they've lost. Their defensive mechanisms are so efficient at suppressing attachment feelings that they don't initially experience the grief and loss that typically follow relationship endings. They mistake this emotional numbness for evidence that the relationship wasn't important, rather than recognizing it as psychological protection from painful feelings. As their defenses gradually relax in the absence of relationship pressure, suppressed emotions begin to surface. The avoidant starts to feel the attachment they denied during the relationship, the care they minimized while it was available, the connection they dismissed as unnecessary. This delayed emotional processing means they experience the relationship's value only after it's no longer accessible, creating a profound sense of loss that feels both devastating and confusing. The avoidant begins to remember positive aspects of the relationship that their defensive mindset prevented them from fully appreciating at the time. They recall moments of understanding, comfort, and genuine connection that felt threatening during the relationship, but seemed precious in retrospect. They recognize that their former partner provided emotional benefits they couldn't acknowledge while they were anxiously protecting their independence. This delayed recognition creates a particularly painful form of regret because the avoidant realizes they sabotaged something valuable while it was happening. They understand that their defensive behaviors prevented them from experiencing the full benefits of the relationship, that their fear of vulnerability cost them the very connection they now find themselves craving. This recognition challenges their self-image as someone who makes rational decisions based on accurate assessment of their needs and preferences. The failure of independence to satisfy. The avoidant's entire identity is built around the belief that independence and self-sufficiency provide superior satisfaction compared to emotional dependence on others. The breakup was supposed to prove this theory by demonstrating how much better they feel when freed from relationship obligations and emotional vulnerability. Instead, they discover that their independence feels hollow and unsatisfying in ways they never experienced before. Meaningful connection. The activities and pursuits that previously provided fulfillment begin to feel mechanical and empty. Work achievements don't generate the same satisfaction when there's no one to share them with. Social activities feel superficial when compared to the deeper intimacy they experienced in the relationship. Personal accomplishments feel less meaningful when they can't be appreciated by someone who truly knows and understands them. The avoidant realizes that their former partner wasn't just an addition to their life, but had become integrated into their sense of purpose and meaning. They discover that sharing experiences, both positive and negative, had enhanced their enjoyment and processing of life events in ways they hadn't consciously recognized. The absence of this sharing creates a persistent sense of incompleteness that no amount of independent activity can fill. This failure of independence to provide lasting satisfaction forces the avoidant to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and their own psychological needs. They begin to understand that their pursuit of self-sufficiency might be protecting them from something they actually need rather than something they're better off without. This recognition threatens their entire worldview and identity structure. The growing awareness of emotional poverty. As time passes, the avoidant becomes increasingly aware of their emotional limitations and the poverty of their internal life compared to what they experienced during the relationship. They realize that their former partner brought emotional richness, depth, and complexity to their world that they're unable to generate independently. Their emotional landscape feels barren and monotonous without the stimulus of intimate connection. The avoidant recognizes that they've returned to their baseline emotional state, which now feels inadequate compared to the expanded emotional range they experienced during the relationship. They had access to feelings of warmth, tenderness, excitement, and deep satisfaction that seem impossible to recreate through individual pursuits. They understand that their former partner didn't just love them, but helped them access parts of themselves they can't reach alone. This emotional poverty becomes particularly apparent when the avoidant compares their current internal experience to memories of emotional moments from the relationship. They remember feeling more alive, more engaged with life, more capable of joy and satisfaction when they were connected to someone who understood and appreciated them. The contrast between their enriched emotional state during relationship and their impoverished state afterward becomes increasingly stark and painful. The avoidant also begins to recognize that their emotional numbness, which they previously viewed as strength and stability, actually represents a form of depression or disconnection from their authentic self. They understand that their defensive strategies, while protecting them from potential hurt, also prevent them from experiencing the full spectrum of human emotion and connection that makes life meaningful and satisfying. The realization of self-sabotage. Perhaps the most painful aspect of the avoidant's deteriorating post-breakup experience is the growing recognition that they actively sabotage something valuable through their own behavior. They begin to see their defensive strategies not as necessary protection, but as destructive patterns that prevent them from maintaining the very connections they secretly crave. The avoidant starts to recognize specific moments during the relationship when they chose distance over connection, protection over vulnerability, independence over intimacy. They realize that their former partner was often trying to bridge gaps that they were simultaneously working to maintain. They understand that their push-pull behavior was confusing and hurtful to someone who was attempting to love them despite their emotional limitations. This recognition of self-sabotage creates a particularly devastating form of regret because the avoidant realizes they were the architect of their own loss. They can't blame external circumstances, incompatibility, or their former partner's inadequacy for the relationship's failure. They must confront the reality that their own psychological patterns and defensive choices destroyed something they now recognize as valuable and irreplaceable. The avoidant also begins to see patterns in their relationship history, recognizing that they've repeated similar self-sabotage in previous connections. They understand that their current pain isn't just about losing one specific person, but about a lifetime of choosing protection over connection, safety over love, independence over intimacy. This pattern recognition makes their regret feel both more profound and more hopeless, the loneliness beneath the independence. As the initial relief of the breakup fades, the avoidant confronts the profound loneliness that their independence actually conceals. They realize that their self-sufficiency was partially an adaptation to emotional isolation, rather than a genuine preference for solitude. They discover that they've been managing loneliness rather than avoiding it, and that their former relationship provided relief from this chronic emotional state. The quality of this loneliness differs from simple social isolation. It's an existential loneliness that stems from feeling fundamentally unknown and unaccepted by others. The avoidant recognizes that their former partner was one of the few people who had seen past their defensive presentation to understand and appreciate their authentic self. Losing this recognition and acceptance creates a sense of cosmic loneliness that no amount of social activity can address. The avoidant also realizes that their independence was partially maintained through emotional numbness that prevented them from feeling the full impact of their isolation. The relationship had awakened their capacity for connection and belonging, and returning to isolation after experiencing genuine intimacy feels more painful than it did before they knew what they were missing. They understand that ignorance was protective in ways that knowledge cannot be. This loneliness becomes particularly acute when the avoidant observes other people's relationships and recognizes what they've chosen to avoid. They see couples sharing emotional intimacy, supporting each other through difficulties, and experiencing life as a team, and they realize that their independence comes at the cost of these experiences. They begin to question whether their autonomy is worth the price of persistent emotional isolation, the fantasy of reunion. As the avoidant's emotional state deteriorates, they often develop elaborate fantasies about reuniting with their former partner and reclaiming the connection they now recognize they need. These fantasies serve multiple psychological functions. They provide hope that their current suffering isn't permanent. They allow them to imagine being understood and accepted again, and they offer the possibility of redemption for their self-sabotaging behavior. The reunion fantasies typically involve the avoidant returning with greater emotional availability and appreciation for what they lost. They imagine being able to express feelings they couldn't access during the relationship, providing the consistency and commitment they previously withheld, and creating the secure connection their defensive behavior prevented. These fantasies feel particularly compelling because they promise to resolve both their regret about the past and their emptiness in the present. However, these fantasies also create additional psychological torment because they force the avoidant to confront the possibility that reunion might not be possible. They realize that their former partner may have moved on, developed boundaries, or simply lost interest in reconnecting. The fantasy of redemption competes with the reality of consequences, creating anxiety about whether they've permanently lost access to the connection they now desperately want. The avoidant often becomes obsessed with signs that reunion might be possible, analyzing their former partner's social media for hints of continued attachment, reading meaning into casual encounters or communications, and interpreting their former partner's kindness or politeness as evidence of romantic possibility. This obsession prevents them from accepting their loss and moving forward, while simultaneously preventing them from taking concrete action toward reunion. The comparison trap. The avoidant's deteriorating emotional state is often exacerbated by inevitable comparisons between their former relationship and their current single life or new romantic encounters. They realize that subsequent connections feel shallow and unsatisfying compared to the depth they experienced with their former partner. New people seem unable to understand them as completely or accept their limitations as patiently. These comparisons reveal that the avoidant's former partner provided something unique and valuable that can't be easily replaced or replicated. They recognize that the level of understanding, acceptance, and emotional safety they experienced was rare and precious rather than common and replaceable. This recognition makes their loss feel more significant and their regret more justified. The avoidant also compares their current emotional capacity to what they experienced during the relationship, recognizing that their former partner helped them access emotional depths and authentic expression that seem impossible to achieve independently. They realize that they were more themselves, more alive, and more emotionally expansive when they were loved and accepted by someone who truly understood them. The erosion of defensive justifications. As time passes, the avoidant finds it increasingly difficult to maintain the defensive justifications they used to rationalize the breakup. Their claims about needing space, not being ready for commitment, or requiring independence begin to feel hollow when these things don't actually improve their well-being or life satisfaction. They start to question whether their reasons for leaving were authentic preferences or simply fear-based rationalizations. The avoidant recognizes that many of their complaints about the relationship were actually complaints about their own discomfort with intimacy rather than legitimate incompatibilities with their partner. They understand that their former partner's requests for emotional availability, consistency, and commitment weren't unreasonable demands, but normal relationship expectations that their defensive patterns prevented them from meeting. This erosion of justifications forces the avoidant to confront the possibility that they made a mistake based on fear rather than wisdom, protection rather than preference, avoidance rather than incompatibility. They begin to see their decision-making process as flawed and their self-knowledge as incomplete, which undermines their confidence in their ability to make choices that serve their actual well-being, the cycle of regret and self-blame. The avoidant's deteriorating emotional state often develops into a cycle of regret and self-blame that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. They blame themselves for being too scared to appreciate what they had, too defensive to allow genuine connection, too focused on protection to recognize love when it was offered. This self-blame can become obsessive and destructive, preventing them from either accepting their loss or taking action to address it. The regret also extends to recognizing lost time and missed opportunities for growth and connection. The avoidant realizes that they spent months or years in defensive mode when they could have been developing greater emotional capacity and enjoying deeper intimacy. They understand that their fear of potential future pain prevented them from experiencing present joy and satisfaction. This cycle of regret and self-blame often paralyzes the avoidant, making it difficult for them to either move forward with their life or take concrete steps toward addressing their loss. They become stuck in rumination about what they could have done differently while feeling hopeless about their ability to change their fundamental patterns or repair the damage they've caused. The recognition of pattern and consequence. As the avoidant's emotional state continues to deteriorate, they often begin to recognize that their current suffering isn't just about losing one specific relationship, but about the consequences of lifelong patterns of emotional avoidance and self-protection. They see that they've repeatedly chosen safety over connection, independence over intimacy, protection over vulnerability, and that these choices have created a life that feels increasingly empty and meaningless. This pattern recognition can be both devastating and potentially transformative. The avoidant realizes that their defensive strategies, while protecting them from immediate emotional discomfort, have created long-term suffering and isolation that feels more painful than the risks they were trying to avoid. They understand that their attempts to protect themselves from potential hurt have guaranteed actual hurt through chronic loneliness and disconnection. The consequences of their patterns become undeniable as the avoidant recognizes that they're aging without the deep connections that give life meaning and purpose. They see that their independence hasn't provided the satisfaction they expected, and that their emotional self-sufficiency feels more like emotional poverty than emotional strength. This recognition can motivate genuine change or deepen their sense of hopelessness about their capacity for different choices. Understanding why avoidants feel worse as time passes after breakups provides insight into the hidden costs of defensive attachment strategies and the human need for genuine emotional connection. While their suffering doesn't excuse their behavior or obligate their former partners to provide relief, it reveals the tragedy of attachment patterns that prevent people from accessing the very connections they need for psychological well-being and life satisfaction. This deteriorating emotional state often becomes the catalyst for either genuine growth and change or deeper entrenchment in defensive patterns, making the post-breakup period a crucial time for potential transformation or further self-destruction.